Ben Shapiro has built an empire on the premise that he's the rational voice in an irrational world. With his signature rapid-fire delivery and his catchphrase, "Facts don't care about your feelings," he's positioned himself as the ultimate defender of logic against the emotional chaos of the left. His YouTube compilations titled "Ben Shapiro Destroys," insert target here, have garnered millions of views, creating a cult of personality around the idea that speaking quickly and citing statistics equals intellectual superiority. But here's the uncomfortable truth that Shapiro's fans refuse to acknowledge. Ben Shapiro is one of the most intellectually dishonest public figures in contemporary discourse. His entire methodology is built on logical fallacies, emotional manipulation, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how reason actually works. The man who claims facts don't care about feelings has built his entire career on appealing to the feelings of young men who desperately want to feel intellectually superior to their liberal peers. Today, we're going to apply the same logical scrutiny that Shapiro claims to champion to examine his own arguments. And what we'll find is that the emperor of facts has no clothes, just a very fast mouth and a very selective relationship with truth. One of Shapiro's most recognizable tactics is what's known in debate circles as the Gish Gallop, named after creationist Wayne Gish, who would overwhelm opponents with a rapid-fire series of claims that were individually weak but collectively difficult to address in real time. Shapiro has perfected this technique, speaking at roughly 200 words per minute while making multiple claims that sound authoritative but crumble under scrutiny. Watch any of his "destroys" videos, and you'll see the pattern. He'll make 5 or 6 different arguments in rapid succession, each one containing embedded assumptions, statistical cherry-picking, or logical leaps that his opponent can't possibly address in the time given. When his opponent tries to respond to one point, Shapiro moves on to the next, creating the illusion that he's won through sheer volume of argument. This isn't logic, it's performance art. Real logical discourse requires time for examination, reflection, and response. Shapiro's speed-talking isn't a feature of his reasoning, it's a bug that he's turned into a feature because it allows him to avoid genuine intellectual engagement. Consider his famous encounter with Andrew Neil on the BBC. When faced with a seasoned interviewer who wouldn't be bulldozed by his usual tactics, Shapiro immediately devolved into personal attacks, accusing Neil of being a leftist. Neil is notably conservative, and eventually storming off. This wasn't an anomaly, it was revealing. When Shapiro can't control the pace and format of the conversation, his intellectual facade collapses. The deepest irony of Shapiro's brand is that someone who claims facts don't care about your feelings has built his entire worldview on emotional foundations. His political positions aren't derived from dispassionate analysis of data, they're rooted in a very specific emotional and cultural worldview that he then cherry-picks facts to support. Shapiro's Orthodox Jewish faith isn't a conclusion he reached through rational inquiry, it's a deeply held emotional and cultural commitment that shapes every aspect of his thinking. This isn't necessarily a problem, we all have foundational beliefs that influence our reasoning. The problem is that Shapiro pretends his religiously informed positions are the product of pure rational analysis while dismissing his opponent's values as mere emotion. Take his position on abortion, which he claims is based on science and logic. Shapiro argues that because a fetus has unique DNA and will develop into a human being, abortion is murder. But this conclusion requires a value judgment about when morally relevant personhood begins, a question that science cannot answer. His position is actually based on his religious belief about ensoulment and the sanctity of potential life, not on some objective scientific truth. Similarly, his defense of traditional marriage isn't based on empirical evidence about social outcomes, it's rooted in his religious conviction that marriage is a divine institution. When pressed on this, Shapiro will cite studies about children from two-parent households, but these studies compare stable two-parent families to single-parent families, not same-sex marriages to opposite-sex marriages. He's using the veneer of scientific citation to dress up what is fundamentally a religious position. The man who claims to be guided by facts is actually guided by feelings, very specific feelings rooted in his cultural and religious identity. He's just better at hiding this than his opponents. Perhaps Shapiro's most dishonest rhetorical tactic is his systematic construction of strawman arguments. He rarely engages with the strongest versions of his opponent's positions. Instead, he finds the weakest possible interpretation and then demolishes that, creating the illusion of intellectual victory while avoiding genuine engagement with serious opposing viewpoints. Watch his critiques of socialism, for example. Rather than engaging with sophisticated socialist thinkers like Richard Wolff or David Harvey, Shapiro will find a random college sophomore who can't articulate their position and then use that encounter to prove that socialism is intellectually bankrupt. He's not destroying socialism, he's destroying his own caricature of socialism. This pattern repeats across every issue. When discussing climate change, he doesn't engage with the actual scientific consensus or the most sophisticated climate models. Instead, he'll find the most alarmist predictions from decades ago that didn't come to pass and use those to dismiss the entire field of climate science. When discussing police reform, he doesn't engage with serious proposals for community policing or criminal justice reform. He attacks the slogan, "Defund the police," as if it represents the totality of reform thinking. His famous destruction of the wage gap argument is a perfect example. Rather than engaging with economists who argue that wage gaps reflect complex structural factors, Shapiro presents the issue as if feminists literally believe that women doing identical work are paid less for no reason. He then destroys this strawman by pointing out that different career choices and work patterns affect earnings, something that serious wage gap researchers have been accounting for all along. This isn't intellectual honesty, it's intellectual cowardice. Shapiro has discovered that it's much easier to win debates against weak opponents and strawman arguments than to engage with the strongest versions of opposing viewpoints. Shapiro's brand is built on the idea that he's the guy who actually looks at data while his opponents rely on emotion and ideology. But examine his use of statistics closely, and you'll find a masterclass in how to manipulate data to support predetermined conclusions. His approach to statistics follows a predictable pattern: cherry-pick studies that support his position, ignore contradictory evidence, present correlation as causation when it suits him, and use absolute numbers when percentages would be more revealing, or vice versa, depending on what makes his case look stronger. Consider his arguments about police violence and race. Shapiro will cite statistics showing that more white people are killed by police than black people in absolute numbers, which sounds compelling until you realize that white people make up 76% of the population while black people make up 13%. When you adjust for population size, the disparity becomes stark. But Shapiro doesn't do this adjustment because it would undermine his argument. He's not following the data where it leads, he's selecting data that leads where he wants to go. A genuine data analyst would try to account for these variables. Shapiro simply ignores them because acknowledging them would complicate his narrative. His treatment of economic data is equally problematic. He'll praise capitalism by citing measures of global poverty reduction while ignoring inequality metrics that paint a more complex picture. He'll talk about how free markets lift people out of poverty while ignoring the role of government investment in education, infrastructure, and research that makes market success possible. This isn't honest engagement with data, it's motivated reasoning dressed up as empirical analysis. For someone who positions himself as a champion of logic, Shapiro commits more logical fallacies per minute than a freshman philosophy student. His arguments are a carnival of bad reasoning that would make Aristotle weep. False dichotomies everywhere. Shapiro loves to present complex issues as binary choices. Either you support free markets or you're a socialist. Either you believe in traditional marriage or you hate families. Either you back police or you support anarchy. Real-world policy exists on a spectrum, but Shapiro's universe has only two positions on any issue. Appeal to authority when convenient. Shapiro will cite experts when they support his position and dismiss expertise when it doesn't. Climate scientists are wrong about climate change, but economists are right about free trade. Medical professionals are wrong about gender dysphoria, but they're right about fetal development. His relationship with authority is purely instrumental. Moving the goalposts. When confronted with evidence that challenges his position, Shapiro simply changes what he's arguing about. Challenged on wage gaps, he'll shift to talking about career choices. Challenged on police violence, he'll shift to talking about crime rates. He's like a boxer who changes the rules of boxing mid-fight. The nirvana fallacy. Shapiro routinely dismisses imperfect solutions by comparing them to perfect alternatives that don't exist. Government programs are bad because they're not 100% efficient. Social safety nets are problematic because some people abuse them. But he never applies this standard to his own preferred policies. Ad hominem attacks. Despite claiming to focus on arguments rather than personalities, Shapiro regularly attacks his opponent's character, intelligence, or motivations rather than their arguments. Anyone who disagrees with him is emotional, irrational, or virtue signaling. Shapiro's influence extends far beyond his own content. He's created an entire generation of debate bros who think political engagement means rapid-fire argument, gotcha questions, and intellectual point scoring. This approach has poisoned political discourse by turning complex policy discussions into performance art. The Shapiro model teaches young men that being right means talking fast, having statistics ready, and making your opponent look stupid. It doesn't teach them to genuinely engage with opposing viewpoints, to acknowledge complexity, or to change their minds when confronted with better evidence. It's a recipe for intellectual arrogance and political polarization. This is particularly damaging because many of Shapiro's fans are young men who are still developing their intellectual identity. They're learning from him that intellectual engagement means domination rather than exploration, that being smart means making others look stupid, and that having strong opinions is more important than having good reasons for those opinions. The result is a generation of politically engaged young people who can't have productive conversations across political lines because they've been trained to see political discourse as warfare rather than collaborative truth-seeking. One of Shapiro's most effective rhetorical shields is his Harvard Law School credential. He regularly invokes his educational background as evidence of his intellectual authority, and his fans treat his Harvard degree as proof that he must be right about everything. This is a perfect example of the appeal to authority fallacy. Having a law degree from Harvard makes Shapiro qualified to practice law. It doesn't make him qualified to speak authoritatively about economics, climate science, psychology, sociology, or any of the other fields he regularly pontificates about. But he uses his legal education as a general-purpose credibility boost, and his audience buys it. More importantly, legal training actually makes Shapiro worse at truth-seeking in many contexts. Lawyers are trained to be advocates, to make the strongest possible case for their client's position regardless of their personal beliefs about the truth. This adversarial mindset is appropriate in legal contexts where both sides have advocates, but it's inappropriate for intellectual discourse where the goal should be collaborative truth-seeking. Shapiro approaches every issue like a lawyer defending a client. He's not trying to figure out what's true, he's trying to win the case for his predetermined position. This is why he's so good at finding evidence that supports his views and so bad at genuinely engaging with contradictory evidence. There's a tragic irony in Shapiro's career trajectory. He may have started as a genuine believer in conservative principles who thought he could advance those principles through rational argument. But success in the attention economy has turned him into something else entirely, a content creator who needs to produce outrage and controversy to maintain his audience. This creates a fundamental conflict between truth-seeking and audience retention. Nuanced, honest engagement with complex issues doesn't generate viral, destroys videos. Admitting uncertainty or acknowledging the strength of opposing arguments doesn't build a devoted fan base. Changing your mind when confronted with better evidence doesn't maintain your brand as an infallible logic machine. So Shapiro has become trapped in a persona that requires him to always be right, always be confident, and always have a devastating response to any challenge. This is psychologically impossible for any human being and intellectually dishonest for anyone engaged in serious discourse. The result is that Shapiro has become less intellectually honest over time, not more. Early in his career, he occasionally acknowledged complexity and uncertainty. Now, he approaches every issue with the same level of confidence and the same rapid-fire certainty. He's become a prisoner of his own brand. To understand why Shapiro is so popular among young men, we need to examine the psychological appeal of his brand. Shapiro offers his audience something very seductive: the feeling of intellectual superiority without the work of genuine intellectual development. Many of Shapiro's fans are young men who feel intellectually insecure. They're smart enough to know that the world is complex but not yet educated enough to navigate that complexity with confidence. Shapiro offers them a shortcut: memorize some statistics, learn some debate tactics, and you can demolish any liberal in argument. This appeal is particularly strong for men who feel that their traditional sources of masculine identity, physical strength, provider status, social dominance, are being challenged by changing social norms. Shapiro offers them a new form of masculine identity based on intellectual dominance. You may not be the strongest or the richest, but you can be the guy who destroys liberals with facts and logic. The problem is that this form of masculine identity is built on a foundation of sand. It's not based on genuine intellectual achievement or real knowledge, it's based on the performance of intellectual superiority. When these young men encounter actually knowledgeable opponents or enter environments where their Shapiro-trained tactics don't work, the whole edifice collapses. The tragedy of Shapiro's influence on conservative discourse is that he's abandoned the rich intellectual tradition of conservative thought in favor of shallow gotcha politics. True conservative intellectuals like Edmund Burke, Russell Kirk, and Roger Scruton engaged deeply with complex philosophical questions about human nature, social organization, and cultural continuity. These thinkers didn't try to destroy their opponents, they tried to understand them and then offer better alternatives. They acknowledged the complexity of social problems and the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies. They were humble about the limits of human knowledge and skeptical of radical changes to established institutions. Shapiro represents the opposite of this tradition. He's certain rather than humble, simplistic rather than complex, and focused on winning rather than understanding. He's turned conservatism from a philosophical tradition into a debate tactic. This is particularly damaging because it makes conservative ideas less attractive to thoughtful people who might otherwise be open to conservative arguments. When conservatism is represented by someone who argues in bad faith and treats complex issues as simple, it drives away the very people who might be most valuable to conservative intellectual life. Shapiro's success isn't just about his debating skills or his Harvard credentials, it's about his mastery of the modern media landscape. He understands how to generate content that performs well on social media platforms, how to create controversy that drives engagement, and how to build a media empire that amplifies his message. His Destroys videos are perfectly designed for the YouTube algorithm. They have inflammatory titles that generate clicks, they're long enough to satisfy watch time requirements, and they generate passionate responses that drive engagement. The actual quality of the argumentation is secondary to the performance metrics. This approach has been incredibly successful from a business perspective. Shapiro's Daily Wire has built a media empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But it's been disastrous for the quality of public discourse because it incentivizes the very behaviors that make productive political conversation impossible. Shapiro has essentially proven that you can build a massive audience by being intellectually dishonest, as long as you're skilled at manipulating the attention economy. This creates a perverse incentive structure where being wrong but engaging is more rewarding than being right but boring. For someone who claims to be a fearless truth teller, Shapiro is remarkably careful about choosing his battles. He's built his reputation by debating unprepared college students and weak opponents, while systematically avoiding serious intellectual challenges. When serious scholars or experienced debaters challenge him, Shapiro either declines to engage or sets conditions that favor his style of argumentation. He won't debate economists about economic policy, climate scientists about climate change, or philosophers about moral questions. Instead, he'll debate college students about these topics and then present his victories as evidence of his intellectual superiority. This is intellectual cowardice disguised as intellectual confidence. A genuinely confident thinker would welcome challenges from knowledgeable opponents as opportunities to test and refine their ideas. Shapiro avoids such challenges because he knows his arguments can't withstand serious scrutiny. The few times he has engaged with serious opponents, like his BBC interview with Andrew Neil, he's performed poorly, revealing the shallow foundations of his intellectual persona. This is why he's so careful about controlling the terms of engagement and choosing his opponents. The most troubling aspect of Shapiro's influence is the generation of young people he's miseducated about the nature of intellectual engagement. His fans have learned to mistake performance for substance, speed for depth, and confidence for competence. They've been taught that having strong opinions is more important than having good reasons for those opinions, that winning arguments is more important than understanding truth, and that intellectual engagement is about domination rather than collaboration. This miseducation has consequences that extend far beyond political discourse. These young people enter universities, workplaces, and relationships with a fundamentally flawed understanding of how to engage with ideas and people who disagree with them. They've been trained to see disagreement as a threat to be defeated rather than an opportunity to learn and grow. The result is a generation that's more polarized, less curious, and less capable of the kind of intellectual humility that's essential for both personal growth and democratic citizenship. Ben Shapiro has built an empire on the claim that he's the defender of facts and logic against an irrational world. But examination of his actual methods reveals that he's one of the most intellectually dishonest figures in contemporary discourse. His rapid-fire delivery masks shallow thinking, his statistical citations disguise motivated reasoning, and his confident assertions hide a fundamental unwillingness to engage with the strongest versions of opposing arguments. The man who claims that facts don't care about your feelings has built his entire career on appealing to the feelings of young men who want to feel intellectually superior without doing the work of genuine intellectual development. He's turned political discourse into performance art and conservative thought into a debate tactic. His influence represents a tragedy for both political discourse and intellectual culture. Instead of teaching young people to think carefully about complex issues, he's taught them to think quickly about simple caricatures. Instead of modeling intellectual humility and curiosity, he's modeled arrogance and close-mindedness. The Emperor of Facts has no clothes, just a very fast mouth and a very successful business model built on the intellectual insecurities of his audience. It's time to stop pretending that speed equals substance, that confidence equals competence, and that winning debates equals understanding truth. Facts don't care about Ben Shapiro's feelings either, and the fact is that he's exactly the kind of intellectually dishonest demagogue that a healthy democracy needs to reject.